Well, welcome to you, Sarah and Patrick. I'm grateful that you all have taken some time to do this. I wonder if you would just each introduce yourself and say a little bit about your context before we start the conversation in general.
Well, I can start, I guess. My name is Sarah Melott, and I'm a journalist at the Daily Yonder, which is a nonprofit newsroom about rural America. And I'm in rural Western North Carolina.
So I'm Patrick Poole, and I'm here in my setting. You can see the church behind us. I'm in a rural community that's very much an agricultural community. We're by and large a conservative community, and I've been their pastor here for almost 17 years, and it's quite the honor to be their pastor.
As kind of a springboard question, I'm just wondering, what kinds of trends do you see? What kinds of dynamics do you see as you look at this electoral season ahead that are really specific to or unique to rural communities? And Sarah, you were talking about some of your work, and I'm wondering if you would start off with some of the kinds of things you mentioned.
Sure. Some of the things that I have in mind as we're, heading into 2024, are two major things. There's a feeling among rural voters of kind of political resentment, which I'll explain in a second. A feeling of having been wronged and having been condescended to, and justly so. And then second to that, and maybe most importantly, is a feeling of economic anxiety. And so going back to the political resentment idea, there's there's, as we know, a larger share of the rural population that supports Trump compared to their urban or suburban counterparts. And one of the popular, conceptions about why that is because rural places are generally more white and more and older. They're aging more than other geographies, and so and those populations, older white people, tend to vote more Republican compared to other demographics. And this is partly true. It's partly kind of what explains the different voting behavior in rural places. But a lot of surveys and some rural sociologists have actually found that there's a sense of place and geography that motivates someone to vote more conservatively or vote more Republican, in this case, Trump. And it's what sociologists call a politics of resentment, which is the title of a book by political scientist Kathy Kramer from University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it's a really good book about what happened to Wisconsin voters and their shift towards the right. And then there's a new book out from some sociologists at Colby College called The Rural Voter, and they did I think the biggest survey specifically about rural voters that we have so far, and it's very comprehensive. And they say that it's not just that rural places are older and whiter that they vote more Republican. It's also a feeling of having been left behind or wronged by Democratic politicians or popular culture at large. Another reason, which actually ties into the, I think, economic anxiety part, is a loss of jobs. That manufacturing, when it went overseas, was a huge part of the rural economy. We lost that. Um, rural counties tended to not even recover from the 2008 financial crisis compared to urban places, and then we had the pandemic as we know, caused another employment crisis. Rural counties just hit pre-pandemic employment numbers last November. And so it's been a hard recovery. And so economic issues are really on people's minds right now, especially in rural places.
Yeah, where I'm serving is a little bit of a hybrid from that because we're very much an agricultural background. So a lot of farmers that grow corn, wheat, and soybean. And we're about 45 minutes from St. Louis. So it also makes us a bedroom community. So it turns out that Monroe County, where I'm located, is a very healthy community financially. So some of those things that we would find, say, in the next two counties below, south of us, would look much more like what you're describing in regards to recovery time. But also the stereotype that they have been experienced their whole life of being looked down as, you know, kind of a country bumpkin. That's very much a reality and a point of contention. The folks in my community, and I don't know, can't speak for other communities, but are incredibly well educated, very smart business people, provide just so much benefit to the school boards and to all the different aspects of living community here. So they're absolutely not the stereotype, but they do have to weather that stereotype. In regards to a feeling of disconnect with the urban areas, we hear that a lot. We hear that Chicago gets to make all the decisions and we have to live from Chicago's decisions. And so, and their values don't seem to match up with the values here in Monroe County.
Sarah, you were saying something before about the survey that was done among churches and clergy and some of the insights from that about rural clergy. Could you say something, share that information here?
Sure. The survey that I was talking about is from the PRRI, which stands for the Public Religion Research Institute. I get them mixed up. It's a mouthful. But they did a huge survey on mainline Protestant clergy, and found some really stark differences between rural, suburban, and urban clergy, and some things that I don't think are going to surprise anyone participating in this conversation. But so about 45% of those mainline clergy live in rural areas or small towns, so that's quite a bit of them. And they are more likely to identify as Democrat than Republican. They're also more likely to say, in rural places, they're more likely to say that they disagree with their congregants on social and political issues. 86% of rural clergy sometimes discuss poverty or inequality, and compared to 91% of suburban clergy and 89% of urban clergy. And so I don't know, this is just kind of highlighting I think the fact that maybe a lot of clergy feel like it's hard to talk about these issues because there is more disagreement among them compared to more metropolitan places. And then, you know, rural clergy also more likely to say that when they do talk about these issues, that it's not discussed very well, or that they need to do a better job discussing these.
So coming from the perspective of a mainline Protestant pastor, my leanings are more liberal than the conservative community that I'm in. I would say the heart of this community, at least in the long history, is a moderate conservative rather than what we see today with a much more polarized hard right and hard left. So, but with that in mind, there's still those influences that affect my members that are these voices from you know, radio stations to news stations that really promote this almost propaganda, and you know, it goes on both sides, the right and the left. So to answer your question, yes, it is a challenge to speak the gospel in the midst of an environment that seems hostile. Not hostile to me as their pastor because they are so generous with their gift of allowing me to be their pastor and to listening to, giving me that platform. But speaking in this political climate is something to be kind of careful about.
I'm wondering if you think that there's a difference in, I think, the level of anonymity that you experience in a rural place compared to an urban one, and how, if that contributes to maybe just that rural communities are inherently more conservative because you're going to face more social backlash if you kind of step out of the norm.
Yes, this for sure. My family, we live in the parsonage these days, and we are part of the community. And my whole family has this sense of, we avoid politics. And so those are topics that we tend to avoid. But the primary challenge for me as the pastor is to honor the gift that they have given me to be their pastor, to speak to them, to have them listen to me, and to be in their pulpit preaching the gospel. So in that, I want to respect where they're at, what they can hear and what they cannot hear. So if I get into the political weeds, then the core of whatever values I want to lift up will be lost in the weeds of the political debate, which frankly, I can't really do justice both sides in a 15-minute sermon or a message. So it's some of that living in community and, not alienating myself, but primarily it's wanting them to hear a message week after week that is going to feed them and to help them live out the gospel in a way that is what I think is true. And then the challenge in that is that I can't lose my voice either. So I have to be able to present it in a way that they can hear it and receive it, but I also have to remain true to myself.
I'm just wondering if either of you have particular insights about what works in those kind of, well, I'll call them stretch or uncomfortable or liminal conversations where you're operating out of a strong sense of a framework yourself, and you're encountering someone who has a different framework. And the purpose of that conversation is deepening understanding or maybe potential collaboration or something like that. So I'm wondering if either of you have, things that you've found that have worked, or if you want to say, what is it that hasn't worked?
I think for me, I go into any conversation without assuming that I know what someone believes about something. I think you can get pegged for having a certain, view on all of these topics just by revealing your view on one topic. And I think that probably demonstrates how polarized we are, is that, one aspect of your value system might mean that you have to be on board with all of these other things. If you're a little bit on the right, then you're going to agree with all of these policy and social issues. Or if you're a little bit on the left, you're going to agree with all of these issues. And so that's not necessarily true of everyone. And you might, just not assuming that you already have someone's opinions pegged by the time that you talk to them, I think helps a lot. And letting them explain in their own words, in their own language, what it is that they mean, what they value. Um, I think, I think people want to be listened to. So if you can, listening to someone and saying, "Oh, I get why you think that. That makes a lot of sense." It's not the same thing as endorsing their views. Um, and I think it takes some patience and humility to do that, but I think you're more likely to have a healthy conversation if you can do that. And Steve, you just before this were mentioned George Lakoff's work and his book Political Mind. He talks about political language and how liberals and conservatives talk about their values.
Yeah, if I can, the Lakoff example from Don't Think of an Elephant, which is a more recent book, is, talking about the strategy of tax relief, and that is a setup to think about tax as a burden, as an irritant. What do we get relief from? We get relief from a sore back or from a chest cold or from, things like that, versus talking about an investment. So when we hear certain kinds of programs of government spending, we talk about investing in education and investing in infrastructure and investing in the environment. And so he uses that as an example. In my own experiences, just thinking about a brother-in-law of mine who very much lives in a space of there's rampant government waste. The people who are getting assistance are probably could be, should be working and not sponging off the government. And so as a framework that doesn't support any additional funding for certain kinds of things, and would say that those kinds of problems, the problems of hunger, for instance, or being unhoused, that the churches should take care of that.
Very helpful hearing your thoughts, and I have a lot in common with what you share, and Sarah, just coming from that place of not knowing them, but to discover who they are and keep an open mind to see the value in their position. That speaks to me for sure. I have a few different avenues in my ministry. So there's some things that are better suited to put in an article. For instance, if I want to break down a lot of background information about why a particular program might be a good idea for, if I want to make a case for social programs, then I can do that through an article for our church. And that gives me a chance to put some nuances while still understanding their values and what's important to them. So that gives me a chance to do that. Another setting might be a small group, a Bible study, or a one-on-one. And then that gives me a chance to be more like the interviewer and hopefully also, but a pastor at the same time, guiding to a hopefully a common deep understanding of our inherent goodness and the gift that we are as children of God. And then from the pulpit, it's a kind of a unique challenge, because there I'll have in my congregation people from a pretty wide spectrum, from pretty liberal to very conservative to many that are moderate. And then the point is, how do I speak in a way that's going to reach them? And usually it calls for me to let go of a few things. So usually when I'm giving a sermon, for instance, this last week, and what was in my heart was these images of the immigrants coming up from the South into the country, and my heart breaks to see them. But that's a highly political position here in my congregation. So one side says, build a wall, put up forces, keep them out, they're drug dealers. The other side would say, look at these people looking for a refuge, looking for a home. And so how do I speak to that? How I speak to that is to the core of each and every one of my members, that they absolutely love people and care for people. So then I speak to the heart of the matter, that let's lift up that we're all brothers and sisters, regardless of where we come from or where we live. Now, I won't be specific and say it's our brothers and sisters trying to come over the border, because that will close the ears of a fair amount of my congregants. As I challenge myself to say, well, am I going far enough by not being specific? And that's something I think I'll just have to continue to wrestle with, but the outshot is that over these years that I've been with them, I can see that that they become more open and more loving and more compassionate. And I get to hear them tell their stories about how they're doing what they can to make a difference for these different groups.
Well, I'm curious also in just, the stance, Sarah, that you talked about in terms of really developing, and I think maybe there are natural listeners. Some of us are better, some of us worse. But I also think there's, some commitment and practice that goes into really listening to and hearing others. And so that next step of being in these conversations with people where there is going to be this difference of perspective and where we operate out of a certain framework. I'm just curious, Sarah, in your work, have you seen in communities or with other journalists, with your own work, where you live, things that help to encourage continuing the conversation instead of closing it off?
I don't know if I have a really sophisticated answer to that, other than just to ask more questions. I think that, I mean, that's the only thing I really can think of value to say in response to that. I mean, when when I first started doing more interviews and I was reading through my transcript, if anything, it kind of highlighted how I need to improve my listening skills in certain areas, because I'll go, and even now still I've gotten better, but I'll go through transcripts and be like, why did I not ask this question? Why was I not thinking about this when they were talking about this? Or um I don't know, we get in our heads about thinking about, well, I have to make sure that this interview goes well and I say all the right things and I ask the right things. And so you're thinking more about what you're going to say next rather than really, taking in whatever the other person is saying to you. And listening well lends itself to asking good questions, I think. One thing I want to point out about disagreements in rural places and what's at stake if you don't continue having these conversations and having them in a way that is not divisive or rude or too nasty, is that rural places already have a harder time with adequate infrastructure, especially like civic infrastructure, places like libraries or what some call third spaces. So, not places where you're either at home or at work, but like public meetings places, a green space, a trail, a park, things like that. Rural places don't have as many options for those kinds of things as urban places do. And so when I was writing, Steve found me through my article on the disaffiliation among the UMC congregations. And when I was doing that, one thing that I was thinking about a lot was the fact that several of the pastors that I talked to were like, this is a big deal, because if we can't figure out how to move on as a congregation together with this, whether we vote one way or the other, if it totally splits the church in half, then it's not just the church that's split in half. It's a vital part of the community. There might not be another public meeting space or many other public meeting spaces in this small town that does this the way that we do. And so, you know, you're losing an asset in the community, basically.
Patrick, what are some things that you've seen that help encourage people to lean into these conversations, to keep going and in being connected to one another, that support that kind of social infrastructure that Sarah was talking about?
Yeah, I appreciate it. When Sarah was speaking, it reminded me, so we have the church as a big umbrella as that is, and people come into it, they feel safe, and they're able to express their thoughts or their opinions. They can come and be freely who they are. That's a really fragile existence. And but at the same time, we have to weigh into these different areas, and frankly, there's a lot more that we can do as a church to provide opportunity for people to have much more dialogue over the issues that we face together, from global warming to social programs, and the list goes on and on. Really, I think that's a real opportunity for us to provide more for our congregation. And there's so much that as the pastor, I'm somewhat limited in being able to do, because I want to make sure that they all feel like they have a place in church and at the table, as we like to say. But I feel like they're hungry to hear different voices, different authorities on these matters, and really just letting it to the news media to say, here's framing it from the perspective of Fox News or NBC or whatever that is, isn't really enough depth to help our people sort through the challenges that we have.
Yeah.
Other than that, on a regular basis, we have different small groups and people share their viewpoints, and we try to kind of take all those viewpoints and let them get aired out and vented. And usually what we settle in on is something that's much more moderate than any extreme. But that's just kind of an organic thing that happens. So I think there's both a lot more that we can do, and probably more that we are doing than I realize. So thanks for the conversation.
Mhm. I'm wondering if there's any, kind of something you really want to communicate as we wrap up, that there's something else that we didn't touch on, or as we've had this conversation that came to you, but something that, as a kind of conclusion of our time, you would want to share with the people who are going to be participating in this workshop.
Yeah, I would say as a pastor, I'm able to come into conversations standing for different truths, right? So when I'm having a conversation with my congregation, either from the pulpit or in a Bible study or one-on-one or even through an article, I have the calling or the position of seeing them for their greatness, knowing that they've got hearts that want to share and to give, and that they express that through many different ways. One thing that's so common here in a rural community is neighbor taking care of neighbor, and that's something that I will never get over being inspired by. So this one couple lives across the street from this much older elderly lady, and every day for years and years they go over, get her mail, bring it into the house, check on her once or twice a day, and make sure that she's okay. And then if something breaks, they're right there and they fix it for her. And they're not family, they're not blood, that's just what you do. And I can come up with countless stories just like that. So what's more real, their political position or my difference in their political position, or the heart that cares so deeply for one another? So for me, it's really standing in the profound gift that they are and speaking to that.
I really like that you highlighted that sense of community in rural places, and this, I guess, is an opportunity to say that I really recommend reading The Rural Voter and this new book out this year, because it talks about that kind of how that kind of neighborliness influences politics and opinions about social issues among rural people. There's a profound sense of place among rural people that is kind of unique, and it makes people want to take care of each other, and it fosters a sense of we're all in this together. I mean, part of their survey found that if someone felt like if someone was wealthy in a rural community, but they felt like their community wasn't doing well economically, they felt that anxiety with them. And there's some really interesting studies about rural people. If you're wealthy in a rural place, you're more likely to live next to poverty than if you were in an urban place or a suburban place. And so yeah, there's a feeling there's less segregation in rural places, racial and socioeconomic too. This feeling that yeah, we're kind of in this for better or for worse together. We have the same fate. So and that's really important, but an important way that people like, they kind of filter their politics and opinions through that view. So
Thank you. And I want to encourage people, if you haven't bookmarked the Daily Yonder, to please do. It's a really extraordinary publication, and certainly you can sign up and get things in your email that are regular, and also look at what Sarah has published there, which is, as she said, the way I was able to invite her to be a part of this conversation was reading her work and discovering and learning a lot from that. So I encourage that. In the olden days, I would have said if you're ever in Maystown on a Sunday morning, stop by at 10 o'clock for service at St. John's. But of course, if you're in Facebook land and you are available at 10 o'clock Central Time, you can also stop by St. John's as well. So thank you both very much for participating in this, and just really appreciate your thoughtfulness and your perspective on this.